Coffee is the champion of breakfasts. So this is Dustin DaHusky again, and now to our third and final installment to why do we see 70s and 80s cars as pure shitboxes and nothing else? Not much of any other value but to ridicule, to drive and beat on, and junk them as fast as we can find something else better. And there's some good reasons why that could be. Mechanically, I have a hard time kind of seeing it. Just because, well, engines were simple back then. The interior, I can see. There might be some batches of inferior product that found its way onto the factory floor, assembled onto cars, and then out the door. And plastics, rubbers, fabric, cloth fabric, vinyl fabric, whatever, may not be up to the test to last 10 years. May not even be up to the test to last 5 years. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes, in my opinion. The exterior, we're going to be talking about the whole body shell, paint finish, and corrosion resistance, as well as maybe, let's talk about structural engineering as well. So, let's talk about the quality of the steel. And I'm going to tell you this. The quality of steel has definitely drastically changed over the last 80 years for car manufacturing, even 100 years. I'm going to do a short recap of my experiences with sheet metal steel and condition and finish from cars from the 1920s to, let's say, today. So the last 25 years, cars have a lot of good corrosion resistance materials and preventative measures to make sure that these cars last on the road for quite some time. That's evident. So much so that the 3 cars I've owned that are not the Skylark, my 96 Cavalier, started to rust out at 12 years old. However, it got really, really bad. The rockers were gone. The wheel arches were starting to rust out. The front fenders were starting to rust on the bottom. The leading edge of the hood is starting to rust out. That was so easily me doing body work was able to at least correct all that. You can certainly polish a turd, but you can only polish one for so long until it just is not well worth it, which that car underneath had structural problems. And it eventually broke in half at the firewall because structural problems. Compared to my 07 Kia Spectra, didn't really start to peak out with rust until it was 14 years old, and it was a relatively strong, structurally stable car. That's 2007, so that's 11 years difference from my first car. The 90s, which is a lot better than the cars before it, lasted about 10-12 years before it finally rusted out and was able to fix it until it finally rusted out at age 19. It was going on 20, but it never reached 20 years old. So, metal quality, as far as zinc plating or galvanized steel quality, has significantly increased over the last 30-40 years. Even so, in the last 20, has substantially increased in quality. So cars built today are going to absolutely last longer than cars 20 years ago and even 40 and so on, with thinner sheet steel, thinner gauge sheet steel. Because, of course, cars need to be a bit lighter to get better fuel economy and better range. Especially for electric cars, that's still going to be very relevant in our future. Aluminum is a very common metal, but it's a very specialized metal, so we don't know how that's going to be incorporated across the board. It's only used in special applications. Mostly bigger vehicles that, I don't know why we even started attacking trucks first with aluminum than cars, but that's not a story. So 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, and maybe 60s, had much more thicker sheet steel. As cars went on, the sheet steel gets a bit thinner and thinner. Well, the sheet steel of the 60s was certainly a bit thinner than that of the 50s, and thinner than that of the 40s, and thinner than that of the 30s, which, if you ever go to an old barn, an old farmstead, you find cars parked behind a barn, the farmhouse, wherever, chicken coop. You find cars, the shells of these cars from the 20s, 30s, and 40s, sitting out there in the fields for decades on end. And yet, there's surface rust, and maybe even some paint left over on that car from back when it was either painted with the original enamel paint, which is very hard wearing, or lacquer. Actually, I think it was more lacquer than anything else, which is hard wearing. It's impressive to burn through lacquer paint. You can certainly do it on purpose, but hard to do on accident. And that sheet steel is incredibly thick to the point that it would be impressive to see thick sheet steel from that time period to totally rust through. It's impressive. So I rarely see, from my experiences of working on these cars, have ever seen much more than a rusty floor. That did chew through because it's the lowest point of the car. But everything else, the rest of the body and the frame, which of course is even thicker bar stock. I don't know about bar stock. Bar sheet stock? I don't know. But C-channel frames from cars at that point are bulletproof. You can never rust through them. Even if you purposely try to rust them, they still won't rust through. Never had an issue rebuilding an old car from that time period, besides welding in a new floor. And maybe trunk area. Actually, trunk pan and interior floor pan. Pretty much it. And then the 50s, you might see a bit of some fender and quarter panel rot, some rocker rot. Mostly the floors are still gone. Pretty much floors on any car are going to rot out first. And that's just a given. It's just how it is. So any car, regardless of age, if it's steel, will rot on the floor first before anything else. But the 70s, I can sort of see why people call this the shitbox era, because they were really cheapening out. In the 60s, we didn't have, and prior, galvanized sheet metal. That didn't really come out until the mid-70s, and even still was sparingly used and was only coated on one side. So you may have exterior sheet metal protection from the outside world, but not on the inside, which a lot of cars rusted from the inside out from this time period. And so did the 80s. It wasn't until they did a lot more to protect their cars to last a bit longer. Many manufacturers didn't bother. Even the Japanese imports didn't bother. They knew that these cars are going to be reliable, but in more aggressive, salt-driven climates of the Midwest and the North, these cars will be off the road in 10 years' time. They'll buy another Toyota anyway. Because they like the first one so much and so reliable, only rust will kill a Japanese car, not so much the mechanics. So rust-proofing didn't really become a major push by manufacturers until the late 70s. That's when they realized if someone can keep a car for even longer, which goes against their whole production model of you build a car cheap enough to not be bothered with rust-proofing, that it'll rust out anyway, which in the 70s got bad. A car will rust out in 5 years in the 1970s. It did not matter what manufacturer. European brands rusted away faster than anything else because they're not used to American use of salt. Germany has banned the use of salt for decades on winter roads. They use sand. They use sand and cinders and anything that can be used to melt snow in a more less aggressive way than salt. They do that. So does France. Italy does not have that bad a winter, so it's not so much an issue for them. Hence why a lot of Fiats are all rotted out to hell, because they didn't need the use of rust-proofing to begin with because their winters were quite mild. There was no need. So you see a lot of Italian cars rust away like wafer candies, or if it's just wafer thin metal and not protected by any means, they're going to rust out so much faster. So Italian cars from the 70s and 80s period is hen's teeth. Especially finding one that's not rusted through is you not only have a bridge to sell, you actually have a bridge to sell. A legitimate bridge. So, sheet metal quality matters a lot. One of my good friends, Rich, in the reenacting world, in the 1970s, he bought a slightly used, meaning a few months old, was bought and was handed back to the dealership. So barely used, nearly brand new, Chevy Vega in 72 or 73. So just when they came out. And he had that car for a year. When he drove over railroad tracks, one of the rear suspension mountings snapped. I forget if it was a coil or if it was, I don't know if those were a leaf spring or coil rear suspension. It's rear wheel drive anyways, so solid live axle. I don't know how. I'll have to take a look. But he said that the rear suspension totally snapped and bottomed out. So, of course, materials even for springs pretty bad. So you can tell that the metal quality at this point was really cheapening out, especially for cars. The smaller you go, the least amount of time that manufacturers are going to take care into producing them. They're not going to last. People are going to may end up be buying for a better, either buying another one or they're going to be buying up. They're going to go up the scale of size in their hierarchy of cars. And the bigger the car, the more time they're going to spend trying to make it so that they'll last a lot longer. But they still didn't. They still rotted away within the decade. So he had his car for about a year because it literally rotted through in 1 year. Chevy Vega, which is I believe, domestically the cheapest or the second cheapest car you could buy in America at that time. It was certainly cheap because GM made sure it was cheap, and they literally rusted away by their thousands each year as they were brand new. I think they sold about 400,000 in their first year in 1971, and I doubt any of them made it past 1975 without being junked. That's 3-4 years of use. For a car, that's absurd. You buy a car, it's your biggest investment you ever make, and yet it rots away so fast. The paint doesn't do anything. It definitely protects the outside of the car because the paint is what helps the car's metal. It's a good thing to, hey, you paint a car to make it look nice with different colors, but it actually, paint does stop resistance on the outside as a boundary layer until it gets scratched through and then it rusts on the outside. So you get rust starting from the outside, but a lot of these cars, because they had no galvanized sheeting, rusted from the inside all the time, every time. So it didn't make a difference until they were starting to dip their cars, which they dipped their cars to clean the finished bodies of oils so that paint can properly be applied, because you cannot paint on top of sheet stamping oils. grease from the stamping dyes. You couldn't because the paint would not stick. So they still acid cleaned their cars, but they didn't do much beyond that. It wasn't until the mid-70s did people thought, hey, what happens if we gave our cars a fighting chance by dipping it after acid cleaning into a anti-corrosion dip? This is still before a galvanized sheet metal was even introduced, so it's a good step in the right direction. Your metal is still not zinc coated, but hey, additional corrosion protection both inside and out. You know what? That actually helped. It actually increased the life of these cars almost 5 or 10-fold. They lasted a lot longer, which is great. And it also shows that you can build a dependable car and a car that you can drive for years and years. All right. And then eventually someone had the bright idea of, well, what happens if we used galvanized sheet steel on a majority of the panels? Or at least on ones that are removable, hood, fender, doors, trunk lid. They did that at first, and then they said, well, why not we do the whole car? And now the whole body shell got galvanized sheet steel. Okay, all right, now we're cooking with something. And plus, on top of acid cleaning the body for proper painting and primering, and anti-corrosion dip for added protection, both inside and out, before primer and base coat, and before clear coat. But clear coat wasn't a huge thing until late 70s, early 80s anyway, so clear coat wasn't a huge thing at that point. So it was just primer, base coat, done. All right, so now the quality of sheet metal has definitely improved by the late 70s. Cars are lasting a bit longer. Granted, they're still rusting away. Anyway, however, you're giving a car a fighting chance almost double than what it could be. Instead of 2, 3, 4 good years of owning a car before it fully rots away in the 1970s, you had a good 6, 7, 8 years before it did that. Okay, you've doubled the lifespan, the service life of your car. That's a good thing. That's a good thing for the manufacturer, because that means, hey, we would rather have people buy a new car every so often, but what happens if we kept our cars longer on the road? Give the buyer, give the consumer confidence that our products are lasting longer than others. They might buy our car more often. Look at that. Fucking fantastic. And that's when manufacturers decided to start using corrosion-resistant materials in the actual production of their cars. Normally, they would literally have a car, as far as galvanized sheet steel, anti-corrosion dip, or coating, and I'm just giving this as an example, GM's Plastisol, or plastic paint coating on the rocker panels and on the lower door edges. That's kind of a primer, but it's more of a plastic primer texture before the primer and then base coat. Manufacturers were only doing that, and only that. Maybe wheelhouse lining with similar coatings, but more coarse and more durable. I believe my Skylark has. Factory. Now, they started doing this in the 60s because they know that these things rotted out so fast, so they sprayed the inner wheelhouse tubs with this plastic-like coating that sticks so well and does a good job at protecting your wheelhouses that they don't rot through, because that would be the first thing to go, which a lot of people complained. But beyond that, there was no other corrosion protection on my car. So, there we go. But if you wanted more corrosion protection, you took it to a third-party business that will help protect your car by adding more bottom floor pan protection, by adding more of this plastic material underneath your car to help prevent more corrosion. AMC was the very first car company to actually do this at the factory. It was an option, but you can certainly do that with any model they produced in Kenosha. So much so that I've talked to some of the factory people that worked in Kenosha, worked at American Motors, asked them about their corrosion protection of their cars back in the 70s and 80s and what they did for fun, because these cars rolled the factory line quite slowly. If there was a car that was actually Z-barded at the factory, not just outside the factory. AMC was the first car company in America, and maybe the world, to have a fully rust-proofed car. At least advanced rust-proofing, before many manufacturers decided to look into it, because they needed their cars to last, so they can have future buyers to keep buying their products. They were playing tic-tac-toe in the drying plastisol underneath the car as the car was moving by. And these guys go to the Kenosha Homecoming every 3 years to look underneath these cars to see which ones they've actually helped build, by looking for a tic-tac-toe game that they either won or lost 45 years ago. So it's pretty cool. So paint quality. So we talked about sheet metal quality. We're talking about rust proofing. And pretty much throughout the rest of the 80s, up to this point, they continued what they already have done, growing and building up to in the 1970s. The 80s doesn't really change all that much as far as rust proofing is concerned. Really up to that point, nothing much doesn't really advance further than that. Paint. Paint quality is still quite durable at this time. Not much can be said about it because it doesn't really drastically change much, except for the addition of clear coat. Clear coat was starting to appear on cars with metallic paint in the early 80s to give luster to the car's finish, because if you were to buff out a matte color, you can keep that color looking pretty shiny, but if you had metallic paint, you will take a bit of the metallic fleck in the paint off when you buff out a car, and you will have less metallic sheen in the paint. So you want to put clear coat on top of the base coat to give it more of a fighting chance to last longer. What do you know? Manufacturers are actually trying to make their cars look great long after they produce the car. Alright, so hey, the shitbox era. Looks like manufacturers are slowly trying to get the idea that maybe it's not a bad idea to keep these cars longer on the road. Makes us look good. Perfect. Alright, so clear coat is about the only advancement in paint there is in the 1980s. And we still have it today. And to be honest, another layer is always great. On the outside. The inside will eventually get, well, it's going to find moisture somehow. It's always going to rust from the inside anyway. But with galvanized sheet steel, corrosion dipping helps. And will likely keep a car on the road for 10 plus years. Although it really depends on how well it's been prepped, but there we go. Also, fun fact, you can tell if a body panel hasn't had enough pressing oil or grease on it if you see wrinkles on the sheet steel. If you see wrinkles, like wavy ripples in the steel, you know that whoever stamped that particular panel did not coat that steel enough to where that it would evenly iron out during the stamping process. So, if you ever see that on a panel, you know someone didn't put enough grease on that, which may also tear and may also be potentially a weak spot. Maybe. Normally not, but if you don't use any grease on a stamping die, you will literally rip apart that sheet steel and you'll have production problems because you damage the die, you damage both sides of the die, and that's costly. Those dies cost about tens of thousands of dollars, and they go through a few each year. And if you destroy one of them because you didn't put enough grease on a sheet steel section, you're going to wish you didn't exist at this company, because replacing body dye is not something a company would plan to do unless they know it's time to do it. And you do it before they have a chance to do it. You're going to be their, you're going to go on what their equivalent of their shit bucket list. So, as I digress with metal quality and painting, all that combined throughout the late 70s into the 80s, paint and metal quality and rust-resistant preventative measures have actually kept these cars longer on the road. This is a good thing. However, it's for nothing if you don't take care of your car. Which a lot of these cars seem to be disposable. So not many people tend to wash their cars. Washing to make them look nice, but just wash them all around. Wash underneath the wheel wells, wash underneath the floor pan, suspension mountings. Anywhere where filth can get and cling onto, it will eventually rot away. Moisture has much to do with that, but you don't give a car a fighting chance if you never clean it. It won't stay rust-free forever. If you wash your car regularly, your car will not rust as often. Well, it will still rust, but it'll last a lot longer before it does. So as far as that's concerned, metal and paint finish matters. And during this time period, cars lasted longer, although Americans are not accustomed to maintaining their cars to a level Europeans do. To buy a car in Europe, that is a big step up the social chain. Once you bought a car, it was a huge commitment. So you took care of your car. You washed your car almost every week, maybe sometimes every other week. In Paris, there is a rule where you're not allowed to have a filthy car. In the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, you were not allowed to own a filthy car parked on the side of a road in Paris. You had to make sure your car was clean. Just a rule. It's just a rule in the cities in Europe, and this is across all of Europe. Even the Eastern Bloc, even in Soviet Russia, if you lived in Moscow, you were fined for having a filthy car. So, in Europe, there was a different attitude to maintaining your car. And you know what? A lot of these cars lasted a lot longer than I actually ever anticipated they would, because they were well taken care of. Cars of the 1950s and 60s lasted so long in America because people knew how to take care of a car, knew that it was a big investment, and they took really, really good care of them by giving them a wash every week or every other week, cleaning out the aluminum, stainless steel, and chrome pieces to make sure that they don't tarnish or rust. Chrome pieces will rust. Unless it's pig iron. Then it's just chrome plated. And then really the 70s, you see a huge drop in people maintaining their car on their own time. And people got a bit more lazy in terms of maintaining their car. So, is it really the car's fault that it rusts? Premature rust ain't good. That's on the manufacturer. But when the manufacturer is the one actually giving you a fighting chance to have your car stay on the road for 10 plus years, and you don't take care of it, I think that's more on the driver. That's more on the owner of the car that should be taking better care so that these cars will last longer. Oh, yeah, I bought a Honda Civic in 85, and, it was a total shitbox, rusted out. Well, did you at least give it a wash? Oh, no, I didn't do anything to it. Well, there's a reason why you never took care of it. If you at least take care of your car, it'll last a lot longer, and it may even give you longer service than you might expect. Here's actually a good example where it's climate, but also possibly vehicle maintenance or just simply cleaning it might actually come in handy to help maintain a car's structural strength and just make sure it doesn't get too rusty to the point that you can't drive it anymore. There's one local named Bruiser who absolutely loves front-wheel drive based GM A-bodies. So you're looking at Celebrities and Centuries. And he's had many of them for as long as I've known him. So he is pretty much your guy to go to on celebrity stuff or knowledge, which is pretty cool. And I think he had like a pea green, it was like an 84 and an 85 Century. No, not Century, Celebrity. It was like a base model but anyway, it was clean underneath when he bought the thing, and he decided to drive it as his daily driver. He loves collecting these cars. He likes finding clean examples across the country and bring them back to rusty, salty Wisconsin. Some of them tend to be his garage queens, and he keeps them in a storage or in a garage where they don't see much snow. So these cars are his babies. However, he will find a candidate to drive in all weather occurrences. That includes Midwest snow and Midwest amounts of road salts. And I think within about 2 years or 3 years' time that he had this pea green Celebrity, or it could be shorter, I don't know. He took a picture of it when he bought the car underneath, looking forward from the left side. So you see the floor pan, you see the rear suspension mountings. Quite a really crisp looking underside of this car. Looked pretty good, looked pretty solid. Then after a few winters in the state of Wisconsin, and then he took a picture of it, same angle, and totally corroded, totally falling to pieces, and probably not safe to drive much longer than that. It wouldn't be too long before something could fail. And then he junked it because it was so rotten. He took what parts he could from it and just sent it to the crusher. That can be said about any car, modern or old. If you're going to drive it in winter and probably not even bother to clean it, it will certainly rust. And sometimes, even if you do clean a car, sometimes a car will just rust anyway. I guess it really depends on a case-to-case basis on individual car, on how it's produced, its batch of steel, its batch of paint, pretty much the individuality of each car is going to determine how long it's going to last, but also too, the driver will also tell you or show or tell the car how long it will last under his ownership. It's just a good example of, even a surviving example, you use as a daily driver for many years, and then it will eventually rust up because, well, it's metal. It's going to rust eventually, and it's an 80s car. The time period of shitbox is just what it is. However, if he would have bought a 72 Vega, his car would last probably a year in the winter here. It would probably rust out so fast, you wouldn't have it more than a year. As my friend Rich had with his then brand new Vega, lasted a year back in the day. So exterior wise, okay, maybe let's talk about fit and finish. Orange peel for paints, maybe clear coat or base coat wasn't fully polished up well, so you might have some orange peel. It's a small issue. You know what? It's about appearance of the car, but it doesn't really affect anything about its operation or possibly longevity. Ain't gonna do much. It's just literally a small detail to bitch about, but I never bitched about orange peel on any of my cars, and they all had orange peel. But I always thought it's extra thickness of paint. It's going to help some way. I'm not going to bitch about it. So it's usually a finishing thing. However, fit and finish of exterior trim, whether if it's window trim, plastic trim, door trim on the outside, or rub strips, bumpers, body fillers, grills, and body panels. This is still a time when cars, they lined them up adequately well, but it wasn't going to be perfect. Yeah, you can't expect too much from cars from this time period. They were still built okay, but panels may not match up so well, but it takes a trained eye to notice that. However, there's some fit and finish on body panels or trim that are so bad it's just obvious. I mean, for example, here, in front of this, here. Oh, please don't think I'm shitting on the celebrity, because these are just sales manuals or sales brochures that I just have literally right in front of me. I've got Cavaliers, Spectrums, Sprints, Novas, Citation, Chevette. Here, for example, 1988 Celebrity Wagon. It's a nice looking car, actually. These things are pretty cool. If I can find one, it'd be fun to have a summertime machine, because I think it'd be pretty cool. But let's talk about fit and finish, and look at the window trim on the lower edge of the door. Or actually, this is technically lower edge, so upper edge of the door. Actually, you can even see the door frame not fully lining up on top. You know what? Kind of expected. And believe it or not, all these door frames of any car from any time period, if it's a door frame door, they're going to have to get adjusted manually at the factory anyway. Not many people know that. So you use hammers, not in the way that you think. You're going to use the handle of the hammer to actually readjust the orientation of where the curve of the door frame is going to go. Don't do it if you don't know how to do it. Even I really fail to try to get to where I want door frames to go, and I still fail anyway, so But see this window trim there? It's lifting up there. It's actually bowing up on this rear door here, and it's bowing up at this front door in the back where it meets the rear door. That's the kind of small fit and finish problems that a lot of these cars had. Wasn't really corrected until the 90s, when people really paid attention and started bitching. This kind of stuff, people thought, well, this kind of sucks, but you know what? They were kind of a bit more complacent. They were probably getting annoyed by it, but they also didn't care. So it didn't really quite matter. Although eventually would. But this is supposed to be a shitbox time period. And besides that, this is really small. This is really, really, really small stuff. With the shadow line, I can see that this is perfectly, at least as smooth and as flat as it can be, meaning the factories that were producing these cars, the sheet metal bodies, stampings, whatnot, are well maintained, have been regularly replaced during production, and line up very well that even a basic light shadow, based on the curvature of these panels, are relatively smooth, which is a good sign, which means, yeah, maybe GM were slapping these things together, but at least what they're doing is they're making sure that overall quality is still there. In fact, by the time these were ending production, they were being built better than they ever were in the beginning. So, I mean, like, look at this here. That's nice. That's how perfect panel fitment and panel stamping should be. Brand new Jeep Wranglers don't have this kind of quality. Because this might look totally flat, but there's a curve in the panel. You want more curved panels, because if you have a totally flat panel, you're going to have warpage, which why Chrysler and why Jeep want to still make flat-ass body panels for their Wranglers is beyond me. Because that's how you would stop warpage in photos. Even in some of their brochures, they're all warped. But that's Chrysler for you. Chrysler's joke. Sorry. Their older cars were better. Their newer stuff is junk. They're borderline shitbox of the modern age. I would say exterior quality on cars improves during a particular vehicle model's existence in production. It eventually gets better. So the very first few years of a car is going to be rough because they're going to try to iron out all the kinks, which they should have done while prototyping the car and getting it ready for production. It really doesn't happen until a year or two after it enters production, and then the last years of a model's production are going to be built incredibly well, which is why I tell people, if you're going to buy a car, wait a year before buying one, because you're going to find a car right off the assembly line in its first year have some panel fitment issues. That may not look so good. Unless you're Ford, and it's always garbage to begin with. Never buy a modern Ford car. They can't do panel fitment worth a shit. My grandfather had a 2014 Focus sedan. A car that was introduced in, 2011, 2012? 2 years after production, and they still can't get the panel fitment just right. Yet, Ford, producing the stuff they made in the 80s, fit better than the stuff that this car did. So do I think that cars of the 70s and 80s are total shitboxes, mechanically, interior, or exterior-wise? I don't think they're any much different than they are today. In fact, during this time period, quality in cars actually got better during this time period than it is today. Today, there is a quality plateau. It's not getting any better, but it's not getting any worse, but it's about average. Back in the 70s and 80s, manufacturers are trying to get people to become repeat customers. They want to have, from cradle to grave, consumer fans or whatever, people who constantly buy their brand of car. They want to make sure that they keep buying their cars, so they're going to infinitely trying to increase the quality in any way they can. And honestly, the time period of the 70s and 80s shows that manufacturers are willing to listen to consumer demand on what they want, even if they didn't bitch too much about it. When they did bitch, they did hear, they did listen, and they at least tried to implement some small changes over a broad period of time, which I think they successfully did, which I don't think cars from this time period deserve the shit that society in this country has given them. I think there's certain batches of cars that are total shit, but certain batches of that same type of car may be just fine. So you're literally going on an individual basis per car, or per batch of car, per week of production, month of production, year of production. It really is, I would say, random. You could buy one of the best cars an individual built that you're currently buying, or you could be buying one of the worst example of a particular car that they've ever made, and you're going to have so much trouble with it. So, I believe cars of the 70s and 80s don't deserve the bad reputation and image they get. Because I think they've done more improvements to help the production of these cars than they did to hinder it. Yeah, they were still cheap. Yeah, they may be still disposable, but at least they were trying to make ends meet by making the customer a little bit happy. They still don't care, but they know that, hey, if they improve the paint finish even 5%, people are going to be happy with it, then that's all that they're going to do is 5%. And another 5% and another 5%. Drastic improvement didn't really happen overnight. This still took about 10, 15 years before, at the end of the 80s, you were producing really good cars that people would still be proud of buying, although I think the early 70s to mid 70s really hurt the image of any car by giving them a bad expectation that they were going to be junk anyway, when in reality they were perfectly okay. So that is it for me on this small little subject of shit boxes. Are they really shit? I am Dustin DaHusky, and thanks for tuning in.